So in this video, we're going to take a look here at Daniel chapter 4. And so this has to deal with King Nebuchadnezzar and his dream about a tree. So I'm going to go ahead and first of all give a little bit of an introduction about the chapter overall. So it's something very interesting that scholars have noted about this chapter, and that is that the structure of chapter 4 looks what is sometimes known as a chiasm. So, a chiasm is a popular way in which ancient authors oftentimes organized their material. The name chiasm, the first three letters there, you can see chi, so it comes from the Greek letter chi, chi, and it has this structure. There's different forms of it. Sometimes the structure looks like this, where let's say A, if you think of A as the representing the kind of the first line or the first material of literature, then an author moves to the next material, B, in which he or she then explains something else, goes into some new material related, obviously, to the first thing that they said, and then they the next thing that is said is sometimes then called B prime. So this material is related to the material that's in B, and then they move on to the next information, which is then noted with an A prime, which relates to the material that was put in the first section. So you have this kind of A, B, B, A. So materials kind of move in. Now, sometimes the chiasm can be expanded. So you have an A and a B, and then you might have a C, so a third bit of information. And then instead of a C prime, you then have a B prime. And so that B prime material, again, relates to what was in B. It has similar ideas, similar thoughts, similar vocabulary. And then A prime, again, has similar ideas, similar themes that were found in the first set of materials. And so this is kind of what they call an A, B, C, B prime, A prime format. So we see different kinds of chiasms in the biblical materials as well as non-biblical materials. And so some scholars have noted that the structure here in Daniel chapter 4 looks like a chiasm of the A, B, C, B prime, A prime format. So you look at it here in the slide, we've got A basically being verses 1 through 3. The king praises Israel's God. Then B is the king's dream. So that's verses 4 through 17. So quite a bit of information there. A number of verses are kind of collected with this. Then C is verses 18 through 27, where Daniel interprets the dream as announcing God's sovereignty over kings. Then you have B prime, which is the king's dream is fulfilled. So that relates to what was in B, the king's dream. And then A prime, which is the king praises Israel's God. So verses 34 through 37. So, which again relates back to verses 1 through 3. So you see this, and a lot of times in these chiasms, whatever is in the C material, whatever is represented by C, that's usually the main thing of it. So while there's a lot of stuff going on in Daniel chapter 4, those verses in verses 18 through 27 are kind of central. They're key. They're the main thought, main idea that the author tries to get through. So anyway, so that is a little bit of a discussion about the overall structure of the chapter. So we'll now go ahead and move on into the material itself, and I'll read the verses here before I talk about what's inside them. So, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that live throughout the earth, may you have abundant prosperity, the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked out for me, I am pleased to recount. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his sovereignty is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was living at ease in my home and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that frightened me. My fantasies in bed and the visions of my head terrified me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me in order that they might tell me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, and the Chaldeans and the diviners came in, and I told them the dream, but they could not tell me its interpretation. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and who is endowed with the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream. O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods, and that no mystery is too difficult for you. Hear the dream that I saw. Tell me its interpretation. All right, well, I'll package these verses here quickly. So, first of all, though it's in the form of some kind of royal encyclical, some kind of royal announcement, it is meant for, quote, all who live on the earth, not only for those who are in the king's kingdom. So, an announcement for everybody to hear. The doxology, so the material that's in verse 3, repeats words great, mighty, kingdom, sovereignty, to emphasize Daniel's God as the Most High God. This is language that was also used in chapter 3. So this idea of Israel's gods being the God who is above all other gods. So this is not a declaration of monotheism in the sense of there is only one God, but this is a declaration of henotheism. There is one God over all the other gods, over all the other celestial beings. The king describes himself like a tree, kind of interesting enough, prospering. So this word to describe himself. Though Daniel has succeeded before, he is still not consulted until the others have failed. So this idea of, all the non-Israelites, all the foreigners, they still have weaknesses, and here comes Daniel, who is able to triumph over them. Then Daniel is noted to be endowed with a spirit, but is it of the holy gods or is it of God? So notice there in verse 8, who is endowed with the spirit of the holy gods, or maybe something like a holy divine spirit, something to that effect. The Hebrew is a little bit unclear. All right, let's move to verses 10 through 18. So, upon my bed, this is what I saw. There was a tree at the center of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew great and strong. Its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for all. The animals of the field found shade under it. The birds of the air nested in its branches. And from it all living beings were fed. I continued looking in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and there was a holy watcher coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said, Cut down the tree and chop off its branches. Strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from beneath it and the birds from its branches. But leave its stump and roots in the ground, with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let him be bathed with the dew of heaven, and let his lot be with the animals of the field, in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a human, and let the mind of an animal be given to him. And let 7 times pass over him. The sentence is rendered by decree of the watchers. The decision is given by the order of the holy ones, in order that all who live may know that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of mortals. He gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of human beings. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw. Now you, Belshazzar, declare the interpretation. Since all the wise men in my kingdom are unable to tell me the interpretation, you are able, however, for you are endowed with the spirit of the holy gods. So a couple things here about the vision itself. So we have really a remarkable tree, verses 10 to 12. So it's at the center of the earth, and it has a great height, and all these animals find their shade, and the birds are in it. This is a mythological tree that really kind of connects the heavens, birds of the air, as it were, and it reaches its top to heaven, and earth. So it's a tree that connects both kind of spaces. It is a tree that provides food for all and a place for rest for whatever the birds might be. So animals and birds here may be representative of something. The tree is to be cut down. So the tree's destruction is announced by a holy watcher. Now it's interesting, this language about a watcher. We have a Jewish pseudepigraphical work that's known as First Enoch. In First Enoch, we have watchers, and so watchers are these kind of like celestial beings. And what they do is they watch over the affairs of human beings. So we wonder about if the act of watching implies, again, God's attention to the evil in the world. So the watchers come and announce things, and they're announcing basically some kind of judgment that is coming from God. So God has attention, as it were, on what the kings or the rulers, the kingdoms are doing. So who is being instructed to destroy the tree in verse 13? I continued looking in the visions of my head as I lay down, and there was a holy watcher coming down from the heaven. So this watcher shouts out aloud, cut down the tree. But we don't know who was being told to cut this down. So, is this to some other celestial beings that they are to cut down the tree? Is it to humans that are cut down the tree? Is it just basically announcing what is going to happen? So it's not really instructions for anybody particularly to cut the tree down. So how much of this tree is left then, really, after being cut? Now, see on page 68. So in the assigned reading that you have with Sial's commentary, you will notice that on that page 68, it's in the middle of that page. He writes, the order for destruction is decisive, which is understood by the threefold command: cut down, chop off, and strip off. At the same time, the annihilation is not to be complete, although it is unclear what precisely of the tree is to be left and what is to be done to that remnant. The NRSV suggests that its stump and root are left with a band of iron and bronze. and the metallic band is presumed by some commentators to be a protective piece binding the stump. The conjunction and is not present in the Aramaic text, however, and the possessive suffix is with the second noun rather than the first, its root, rather than its stump. Indeed, the Aramaic probably means not its stump and root, but something like the tip of its root. The point here is that the tree is to be cut down so thoroughly that only the very tip of its root will remain, thus allowing only the faintest of hope for rejuvenation. So it's kind of interesting then see how is contending here with the way in which the New Revised Standard Version translators will have that, indicating just how much of this tree is going to be left. So for him, this the Aramaic behind this does not mean its stump and roots, but the tip of its root. So he's contending, as it were, with how the Aramaic should be expressed. So we don't really have a stump left, we just have the roots left, and just the tip of the roots. So a tethered person with the mind of an animal is to show to all who live that God is sovereign. So doing this thing to this tree is indicating God has control over things like this tree. All right, so we're going to get now next to the tree. The dream then is interpreted and fulfilled. So Daniel 4, and I'll start here in verse 19. Then Daniel, who was called Belshazzar, was severely distressed for a while. His thoughts terrified him. The king said, Belshazzar, do not let the dream or the interpretation terrify you. Belshazzar answered, My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree that you saw, which grew great and strong, so that its top reached to heaven and was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and which provided food for all, under which animals of the field live, and whose branches the birds of the air had nest, it is you, O king. You have grown great and strong. Your greatness has increased and reaches to heaven, and your sovereignty to the ends of the earth. And whereas the king saw a holy watcher coming down from heaven and saying, Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the ground, with a band of iron and bronze in the grass of the field, and let him be bathed with the dew of heaven, and let his lot be with the animals of the field, until 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and it is a decree of the Most High that has come upon my lord the king. You shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with the wild animals. You shall be made to eat grass like oxen. You shall be bathed with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals, and gives it to whom he will. And it was commanded to leave the stump and roots of the tree. Your kingdom shall be reestablished for you from the time that you learn that heaven is sovereign. Therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. Atone for your sins with righteousness, and your iniquities with mercy to the oppressed, so that your prosperity may be prolonged. Okay, some things here about the interpretation. So, why is Daniel's Chaldean name Belshazzar used? That's kind of a curious thing, because usually Daniel is being used, but here, we have him in the king's court, so to reflect, as it were, the Babylonian context for which this is taking place, the name Belshazzar is being used. So the king is a tree, verse 22. In the Bible, arboreal metaphors, so metaphors with plants, for humans signify their dependency upon God for survival. So having a king, being represented by a tree. Well, since God is responsible for all of creation, how everything grows, even a king's life, as it were, is dependent upon God's sovereignty, God's sustaining care. The certainty of the dream's fulfillment rests in that it is the Most High's decree. So once again, it is something that is certainly to take place. It is something that will occur. It is not something that is conditional in this sense. But we say it's kind of conditional. It foresees what's going to take place, although Daniel does think it can be averted if Nebuchadnezzar were to atone for his sins with righteousness, to atone for his iniquities with mercy. The king will then learn to recognize that God is sovereign through this experience, being, as it were, brought low, and realizing that his life is really dependent upon God's will. So how do Gentiles, so that's what Nebuchadnezzar is, he's a non-Israelite, so how does this Gentile atone, break off, as it were, for sins? Well, he does this through justice. Righteousness and justice are kind of synonyms of each other, and mercy that shows dependency on God. So, doing things that are just and doing things that are merciful are ways that non-Israelites, as it were, break off from sin. They demonstrate to God that they recognize their behaviors and want to behave in ways that are different. All right, so we'll now look here at 28 through 33. All of this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the time of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king said, "Is this not magnificent Babylon, which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power and for my glorious majesty?" While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, the kingdom has departed from you. You shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be made with the animals of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdoms of mortals, and gives it to whom he will." Immediately the sentence was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from human society, ate grass like oxen, and his body was bathed with the dew of heaven, until his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails became like birds' claws. Okay, so we have the dream now is being fulfilled. Some have wondered really if there is a tension here between verse 28 and 29 as to when the kingdom departs from 28. So it says, verse 20, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. So in other words, did all this come upon King Nebuchadnezzar when, Daniel is explaining to him what the vision means, what the dream means? Or we have 29, we've got after 12 months. So there seems to be some kind of tension here, whether or not we're supposed to have understood that it took place immediately, or if it took place after a year. There is a biblical theme here of arrogance in the form of equating oneself with God. Of course, Adam and Eve's sin is they wanted to be like God. And so that's really the first sin, attempting to do that. and not recognizing God's sovereignty, which is really the issue with Judah's exile. Judah's going to be exiled because it doesn't recognize God's sovereignty. And these kinds of things is punished by being sent into exile or banishment. So Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, and Judah is sent away from the land. So the people are sent away from the land, or many of the people are sent away from the land. So this is how God, deals with arrogance, the arrogance of not recognizing that God is sovereign over all of creation. All right, so that's kind of the central theme or idea of the chapter. Now we'll go to the conclusion of it. So the king is going to learn, and he's going to be restored. So we'll pick up here at verse 34. When that period was over, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored the one who lives forever. For his sovereignty is an everlasting sovereignty, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does what he wills with the host of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can stay his hand, or say to him, "What are you doing?" At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. My counselors and my lords sought me out. I was reestablished over my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are truth, all his ways are justice, and he is able to bring low those who walk in pride. So after the king lifts up his eyes to heaven, his reason, his knowledge then kind of returns to him. So in one sense, he's kind of cast out like an animal, made nothing more to an animal. But then when the period was over, in other words, a certain time is kind of set, as it were, then Nebuchadnezzar can lift his eyes up. Then he can proclaim, or he can make this blessing to the Most High. What the author then is stressing is that recognition of God's God as sovereign over all creation is the appropriate response of humans, especially those who serve as figures of authority over others. And when they don't, then God can bring about judgment upon those figures of authority. So recognizing that authority is important for the author of Daniel. And finally, I'll just make this point that not only is Nebuchadnezzar then restored to his kingdom, but still more greatness was added to him in verse 37. Because what he does is he recognizes that God's way is dealing with truth and justice, and that should be the direction as well for his reign. So we see really in Daniel 4 what the author thinks should be true of all rulers. Now, the book of Daniel was written at the time, or composed finally, at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And what he was doing, and the author sees Antiochus as arrogant and not recognizing God's sovereignty and wanting to strip God's people, the rights of God's people to worship him according to God's law, to God's will. And so because he attacks the temple, and because he attacks their faith, the author of Daniel sees that what happens to Nebuchadnezzar, his downfall, as it were, is going to end up happening to Antiochus. Though when you read the entirety of Daniel, you see that he does not anticipate that Antiochus will come to repentance. He's not going to learn from someone as great as Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to continue in his arrogance and his haughtiness, but will be eventually brought down. So that's a quick overview of Daniel chapter 4.